there's probably some evolutionary reason for being xenophobic that has to do with the spread of disease. But then you take that into the modern context, it seems like some people probably have genes that code for xenophobia that are based on this historical and evolutionary context, and it results in them being more distrustful of outsiders, more homophobic, perhaps even more religious.
Where do you lean politically?
I feel pretty homeless, to be honest. I mean, I don't think that right-leaning people, I think there's certain beliefs that I have which are fundamentally, that just will fundamentally not mesh with a lot of people on the right. So my perspective on transgenderism is one of these views. Like, I think it's pretty important that people have the right to their body and to their presentation. Not everyone's going to agree with that. If you are someone who's quite religious, for example, the underlying theology is that your body belongs to God, not to you. And that to change the body is to somehow tarnish God's creation. And so you have to be very careful in the ways that you change the body. Maybe there's even like a teleological argument, like if you change your body in such a way that it promotes health and the purpose of living, which is maybe to like live according to God's word, then that's okay. But otherwise it's not okay. And so I think that being trans and transitioning is probably like incompatible with that. I have certain views on racial equality, which I think are incompatible with the far right. Like, I will just never agree with some of these people. It's pretty important to me that, you know, you're not racist. I think I'm pretty fundamentally against populism and some of the more like Trumpian elements of the right. I mean, I think it's a total personality cult, and Trump is a narcissist who is incapable of leading, and I think it's kind of ridiculous to be a Trump fan at this point. And so I don't get along with a lot of right-wingers for this reason. At the same time, I don't get along with a lot of left-wingers. I think that the kind of ultra-progressive racial politics have been really disastrous for our country and social relations. I think that a lot of the left-wing arguments along transgenderism, you know, totally miss the point. They get bogged down in these kind of philosophical arguments about what is a woman, which I think are ultimately not the most important thing to do. I think that they have, on the left, a lot of, philosophically, I think the left wing is rooted in a kind of harm reduction and a real moral emphasis on just reducing harm for people. It's kind of like a utilitarianism, which, you know, I don't know if we want to get super into the weeds philosophically, but it just does not work with me. And there's lots of like takeaways from that kind of moral route, which I think lead to bad places.
How come? You said, I don't know if we want to get too into the weeds, but I would actually love to go into the weeds with you, Taftaj.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know how familiar you are with Jonathan Haidt's work, but he has a theory called moral foundations theory. And it basically argues that people differ in terms of 5 or 6 different moral axes. And so these axes are things like care, harm, hierarchy, fairness, equality, and I think sanctity is another one. And so these moral axes are probably pretty informed by personality, and personality is downstream in a not insignificant way from genetics. So we can imagine that over time, different groups of people come to possess different genes, and those genes encode for certain personality traits like conscientiousness, and those have overlap with things like disgust sensitivity. So someone who's highly conscientious in the personality trait, they're someone who is going to really care about cleanliness and order, and that seems to overlap with disgust sensitivity. So we know that disgust sensitivity, it correlates with views on xenophobia, homophobia, and sexism. So if you are someone who has a high disgust sensitivity, you're more likely to be xenophobic. And we can kind of imagine, like, you know, you belong to a population group where your population group, your ethnic group, interacted with outsiders, and when they did so, those outsiders spread diseases to you, and the only people that survived were the people who are kind of xenophobic, right? And that's probably a successful strategy in some historical context, right? Like, if the indigenous Americans were just far more xenophobic in the sense that they just like avoided European colonists, then maybe the spread of disease would have been slowed. So you can think of that as like, there's probably some evolutionary reason for being xenophobic that has to do with the spread of disease. But then you take that into the modern context, it seems like some people probably have genes that code for xenophobia that are based on this historical and evolutionary context, and it results in them being more distrustful of outsiders, more homophobic, perhaps even more religious. And that's probably not something that you can change easily. So another one of these moral axes that doesn't have to do with disgust sensitivity, or I think it was Jonathan Haidt would describe it, sanctity, the desire for like purity and cleanliness. Another one of these moral axes might be care/harm. And so one of the sentiments that you see crop up over and over among the left would be this obsession with care harm. So a good example of this would be trigger warnings. Left-wingers tend to be very concerned with preventing mental harm to people. The irony of that is that we know that when you put trigger warnings in front of something, you prime people to be upset. So people actually get more upset when they're exposed to trigger warnings before reading some text. Moreover, when people don't engage with potentially harmful text, there's good reason to suspect that they become more vulnerable to that harmful idea in the future. It seems like when you are exposed to potentially harmful ideas or feelings, and then you come out on the other end and you survive, that develops a sense of self-resiliency and toughness. You might call this like anti-fragility, I think is how some people refer to it. But I think that that's really important. And so I think that seeking out sometimes difficult experiences, both on the individual and societal level, can lead to more health overall, but that also means more suffering in the short term. And so I think this is broadly politically applicable that, you know, if you set society up such that it doesn't allow people to suffer, you also prevent people from making decisions or taking risks that are ultimately going to lead to a much healthier, more robust, and happy society. For the same reasons that taking risks and exposing yourself to some dangers leads you to becoming a healthier, happier, and more robust individual. So, long story short, I think that fundamental relationship between avoiding suffering or being willing to experience it is something that plays out over and over again on the left wing, and is one of the areas where I find myself just fundamentally at odds with left-wing philosophy and perspectives.
Interesting. Have you ever taken a test that like positions you? I'd be curious to see like what your personal leanings for the like,
Yes,
what did you call it? What's his name again?
test.
Jonathan Hyman?
Jonathan Haidt, Moral Foundations Theory.
Heights.
Yeah. So you can actually take tests. I've taken them before. I think that I scored really highly in